Firstly, I'd like to invite Marta Bazouk, the Executive Director of the Holodomor Research and Education Consortium, who will say a few words on behalf of the track.
Thank you so much, Julia. And I will literally say a few words because I think we're all very much looking forward to seeing excerpts from this powerful interview and hearing from Dr. Natalia Khanenko-Friesen about the experience of interviewing this 101-year-old survivor. I just want to say that, so the Holodomor Research and Education Consortium is a project of the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies. So I'm quite often in contact with Natalia. And when I learned of this opportunity she had as an anthropologist to interview this 101-year-old survivor living in Saskatchewan, I was very hopeful that it would be a meaningful experience because it very well could be the last full-length interview done with a survivor of the Holodomor, someone who still remembers details and who is articulate about his experiences. And we were not disappointed. And when I saw the final results, I thought, what an amazing Ukrainian-Canadian story this is. And I thought of my good friend Jeremy Moron, who works at the Canadian Museum for Human Rights, and we first met, I believe, in 2013, and have managed to stay in touch since, and basically told him about this interview and said, what do you think? He saw potential in it, and I'll leave it at that. We'll now hear more about the interview, and Jeremy, you'll also say a few words, right? Yeah, so that's all I'd like to say, and I'm excited to see. I've seen the interview, but I haven't had the opportunity to hear Natalia talk about this experience and what was meaningful for her. So I think we're in for something really interesting tonight.
Thank you, Pani Bazouk. And now I'd like to invite Dr. Jeremy Moron, the moderator of today's discussion, to the floor. Jeremy Moron is the curator of the Holocaust and Genocide content at the Canadian Museum for Human Rights, where he has worked since 2011. In his role, Jeremy oversees content development in 3 of the museum's core galleries, examining the Holocaust, turning points for humanity, and breaking the silence. He holds a PhD in cultural mediations from Carleton University, where his dissertation focused on the treatment of the Holocaust in Canadian cinema. So without further ado.
Thank you very much, Julia, and thank you to all of you for coming out this evening. It's so wonderful to be here and to welcome Natalia to our kind of gray, rainy city today, but it's not minus 40, so there's that. I want to again thank our partners for this event, Julia, the Center for Ukrainian-Canadian Studies here at my alma mater, University of Manitoba. Had a few classes in St. John's back in the day, so it feels very nostalgic to be back. Of course, the Holodomor Research and Education Consortium, and especially my friend Marta. Thank you for thinking of us when you, well, metaphorically picked up the phone, literally typed the email. Very glad that we could work on this together. And of course, we're also pleased to partner with the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies at the University of Alberta, the institutional home of our esteemed speaker, Dr. Natalia Khanenko-Friesen, who I will introduce shortly, and who will privilege us with sharing Pavlo Nazarenko's remarkable story as a survivor of the Holodomor, which he documented through the oral history interview just a little bit over 2 years ago, I believe, March 2022, I think. And as Marta noted, this was not only probably one of the last interviews with a Holodomor survivor, especially a Canadian Holodomor survivor, but also captured really in the nick of time, as Mr. Nazarenko passed away in late 2023, December 23rd, 2023, at the remarkable age of 102. So the interview was when he was 101. So on behalf of the Canadian Museum for Human Rights, I want to thank Natalia, Dr. Khanenko-Friesen, for allowing us to bring you to Winnipeg amidst the craziness of April in an academic's life, to share Mr. Nazarenko's story with us this evening, but also to entrust our museum with permission to incorporate a brief but very, very powerful clip from Pavlo's interview into one of the exhibits in the museum's Breaking the Silence gallery, a gallery that holistically emphasizes the importance of speaking out, of sharing information about mass atrocities and genocides like the Holodomor, to drag them from the shadows of denial, distortion, and minimization into the light of day, to pursue truth, justice, recovery, and reconciliation. And Pavlo Nazarenko's testimony is a clear example of the power of bearing witness to the historical past, including the painful historical past, and the importance of first-hand voices such as his, which we only have access to for finite periods of time. But as we're going to see when we see some of the clips from Mr. Nazarenko's interview, the sharing of the testimony also carries a cost for him as the teller of his story. It was hard for him to tell this story. As he shared the story with Dr. Khanenko-Friesen, the emotional weight of that which he has carried through his life, his experiences and his memories, and the emotional impact of sharing them is viscerally clear. But despite the emotional and psychological effort that it took, he shared his story because he knew it was important. He spoke out because he felt he knew it was important. And when we reflect on the painful, profound but often painful effects that sharing such personal histories and personal memories have on those like Pavlo who are remembering, when we engage firsthand, or when we engage with firsthand storytellers like Pavlo, as listeners or as interviewers, there is a moral obligation that we make to ensure that these stories of lived experiences are done justice and amplified and made to create lasting impacts, to borrow from the title of this program, to ensure that the river of memory continues to flow. If those with painful memories and painful stories like Pavlo have the courage to share them, we have an obligation on the part of the hearer or the learner to do something with them. And Dr. Khanenko-Friesen, as Pavlo's interviewer, entrusted with his story by Pavlo and his family. His daughter was with you while you did the interview, right? Dr. Khanenko-Friesen is taking this responsibility seriously by sharing and disseminating his story, doing justice to Pavlo's experience that he so generously shared with her through programs like tonight, and by allowing the museum to share Mr. Nazarenko's story in our gallery, and all of the work that I know that you're going to be continuing to do with Pavlo's interview. And it's a privilege for myself and for the Canadian Museum for Human Rights to be part of this opportunity to learn from and reflect on Pavlo's personal history, made possible through his bravery for sharing his memories and through Natalia's work to capture them. So with that, I'm heartened to introduce our speaker for this evening. Dr. Natalia Khanenko-Friesen is an oral historian and cultural anthropologist currently serving as the director of the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies and Huckelek Chair in Ukrainian Culture and Ethnography, both in the Faculty of Arts at the University of Alberta, Canada. Her research interests include oral history, vernacular culture, diasporic and ethnic identities, labor migration, and immigrant letter writing. Amongst her numerous publications, oral history collections, and exhibits, she has authored and co-edited monographs and collections of essays including The Other World, or Ethnicity in Action, Canadian Ukrainianness at the End of the 20th Century in 2011, Ukrainian Otherlands, Diaspora, Homeland, and Folk Imagination in the 20th Century from University of Wisconsin Press in 2015, Orality and Literacy, Reflections Across Disciplines, University of Toronto Press 2011, and Reclaiming the Personal, Oral History in Post-Socialist Europe, University of Toronto Press 2015. Dr. Khanenko-Friesen is also the founding editor of Canada's scholarly journal, Engaged Scholar Journal, Community Engaged Research, Teaching and Learning. Her current book project has the working title Decollectivized, The Last Generation of Soviet Farmers Speak Out. Since February 24th, 2022, the mark of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, she coordinates a number of scholarly initiatives focusing on war testimony research, including founding and hosting the Summer Oral History Institute, Witnessing the War in Ukraine, in Poland. She continues interviewing people for her various research projects in Canada and in Ukraine. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Natalia Khanenko-Friesen.
Julia, Marta, Jeremy, everybody, thank you so much for this warm welcome. I am very pleased to be back to the University of Manitoba and to the Canadian Museum for Human Rights. Thank you for allowing me to be with you tonight. And here I am, on the banks of the river of memory, looking upstream, with you as my audience, and all others partaking in this meeting today, with Paul himself and Lena in Saskatoon, the daughter and grandson of Pavlo Nazarenko, whose blessings I needed to start this journey along the mighty currents of the river of memory that carried Pavlo through the hurdles and obstacles of surfacing up against so much. With Irina, a colleague of mine who connected me with Mr. Nazarenko and his amazing family, with Lisa, Marta, Larissa, Ksenia, all my colleagues at the Institute, with so few remaining Holodomor survivors who break into sadness every time they are remembering, dissecting their own memories of Holodomor. With the world and those in it who closely watch Russia's genocidal war in Ukraine, and with those who don't really care about the war. With my colleagues and fellow researchers of Holodomor and other human rights violations around the world. And with you, dear colleagues, in the Canadian Museum for Human Rights, which now guards and carries the story on. I'm looking ahead. My eyes are reaching the horizon far away, where the river of memory flows, into the distance, into the future. I'm searching for clues, what makes it flow so mighty. What currents of unstoppable force carry the heaviness of the past into the open space of the future, for others to hold on to engage with, to cherish? And why is it important to sustain this gaze? To do justice to Pavlo's story, one has to follow not just one story, but many, as they jointly carry the memory for further and further. Those stories make his story powerful, strong, irresistible, irreducible. That includes my story as well, so I begin. It was the first week of March 2022, just a week into the Great War, which resumed with a new force in Ukraine on February 24th, 2022, wreaking havoc in the lives of millions of people and turning my world upside down as well. There has been no sleep over the course of that week. Phone calls, frantic efforts to reconnect with those who are in the line of fire or who are on the front line or lost already in the mess of it all. A sense of helplessness as Canada is so far away from where your family is. Yet, I packed for Saskatoon in hopes that what I will be doing in the city will restore my own brokenness, give me sense and strength, and will bring the sense of balance into my shattered world. On March 4th, I finally made it to Pavlo Nazarenko's. Pavlo had just turned 101. His Saskatoon home was full of flowers and stories of the family gathering that his daughter and her children just hosted for him a day before. Well, with me came a small crew, a colleague who first met Mr. Nazarenko and who was the point of contact, a filmmaker I invited along, myself as well. We descended on Pavlo's home and his daughter's cozy abode for a good reason. Mr. Nazarenko, for the first time in his entire life, had agreed to be interviewed and to share his story of surviving Holodomor. Pavlo lived through 1932 and 1933 as an 11-12-year-old boy. Most people can remember many experiences vividly from that age, and traumatic ones in particular. I was still processing the fact that this interview would be his first public testimony, and that our team were the first ever outsiders in his life granted this immense privilege of documenting his story. Why had he waited for all these years, I wondered? Why now? I wondered as I prepared for the trip and the work ahead. And being 100 years old, what might this respectable age mean for the telling of the story itself? What does it do to the story? Would it be rich in detail? Would it be marked by deep reflection? It's a 100-year-old person. Mr. Nazarenko's story occupies a unique place in the field of the Holodomor studies. There have been, of course, very many first-person accounts of famine documented and recorded over the years. Testimonies are pillars and are archaeographical foundation of what the entire field of the Holodomor studies rests on. Over many decades of documentation and research of Holodomor, witness accounts have been continually generated and sought after by various parties: Ukrainian studies scholars, the so-called Sovietologists once upon a time dovetailed in the topic, community activists, political groups, each pursuing such documentation for particular purposes. And of course, as well known in Soviet times, the mass famine was denied. No recognition was possible, and even private remembering as a social practice was aggressively suppressed by the Soviet repressive organs. Thus, the Ukrainian diaspora assumed the responsibility to document the famine and disseminate knowledge about the Soviet crimes, seeing it as a genocide directly directed against the Ukrainian people. Self-generated or gathered in response to researchers and journalist inquiries, the Holodomor witness accounts outside of Ukraine were actively collected, either in writing, for example, in letters or memoirs, or verbally as an oral history or other interview-generated accounts. Not surprisingly, for almost 60 years, and across the lifespans of 2 or 3 generations, these pursuits were possible only outside of Ukraine, Soviet Ukraine, that is. As years went by, fewer and fewer survivors were sharing their testimonies. In these days, we are surrounded by so few of those who witnessed firsthand death by starvation. This is why Pavlo's story is unique and so special. To start with, Pavlo's life of a community leader and man of faith did not unfold exactly within what we understand to be the established Ukrainian-Canadian community. Born and raised in central Ukraine, not western Ukraine, he came to Canada in 1989, directly to Saskatoon. He joined his brother, who was already in Canada as a post-World War II DP, displaced person living there. This is not too unusual, of course, but what is distinct in his life path is that he was an active member in the Ukrainian Baptist community. As we know, Ukrainian Canadians' imaginings and stories of their origin and community development never really included a subplot about the Protestant brothers and sisters. Thus, while the mainstream community actively searched for the Holodomor survivors within its own ranks, memories of Holodomor within various Protestant communities across Canada were not really pursued through these documentation efforts as earnestly as they should have been. So Pavlo's story and testimony remained undocumented until his 101st birthday. But in addition, Pavlo's story uniqueness is rooted in 90 years of him remembering the catastrophic events of his childhood. 90 years. His story could have benefited from his parents' stories shared within the family, but given the persecution the Baptist communities were subject to in the 30s and in Ukraine and throughout the whole history of Soviet Union, really, I doubt much active sharing took place when children were young. And then the war began, and the 20-year-old Pavlo got drafted into the Soviet army nearly immediately, losing his mother and 2 siblings to a bombing, which has flattened their own home in Kiev, and they were buried alive, indeed alive, as witnesses accounted in the wreckage. And then he remained separated from the rest of his family. His father and 2 other siblings had arrived to Canada in 1949, and for him, he was separated from them for nearly 5 decades, 50 years. Despite this huge challenge to the continuity of family memory, the stories of Holodomor were carried forward like a precious cargo in clandestine conversations with children. In the course of 9 decades of remembering, these stories traveled across at least 3 generations, 2 continents, and 2 political systems and 3 states. Yet the storytelling remained to be a family affair. And most importantly, the stories are steeped in and framed by Pavlo's unwavering commitment to and faith in God. He was a man of faith. And so here was on March 4, an oral historian clearly entering that very privileged space, the space of family story sharing. But this story sharing was nothing like any other storytelling event you may have experienced yourself, being a member of your family community, so I have experienced as an oral historian, having recorded so many other interviews. Pavlo's story was not really a story in a sense of its genre. With his clear and sharp voice and mind, incomparable ability to focus, and determination to share over the course of more than 2 hours, without much prompting, in his 102nd year, Pavlo delivered a powerful and convincing testimony of what it was to be a man of faith in times of catastrophic ordeal. These days, very few Holodomor researchers have an opportunity to partake in testimony delivery and witness the accounting of past injustices. So many interviews have been recorded a long time ago. We were just discussing it with Marta, right? The most recent ones would be the 90s, I imagine, or maybe early 2000s. Witnessing Pavlo's giving his testimony gave me a chance to observe how testimony, as a statement and as act of testifying, how it is being shaped and shared in the most important conversation of one's life at such an advanced age. So for an oral historian studying personal testimony as a statement and act of testifying, this is truly one of a kind of an opportunity. Pavlo has passed on a few months ago, and here was his obituary, tells about the world about who he was. I'm just going to cite it. Paul was born in Kiev, Ukraine, into a Christian family of Elsa and Philemon Nazarenko. He was one of 6 children. When he was a couple of months old, his family moved to the village of Pilava, where he spent his childhood. Pavlo grew up during the hard years of Holodomor in 1932. His family moved back to Kiev when Pavlo finished his high school, There, he was called into the army a month into the World War II, in 1941. And after finishing artillery college, Paul was sent to Leningrad. By the grace of God, Ladova Lake, the only way of life to the city, melted. And Pavlo was sent to Volhov Ilne instead of facing starvation in Leningrad, so he escaped another starvation in his life. He was wounded and spent 8 months in hospitals. After the war, Paul returned to Kiev. His parents' house was destroyed by the air bombing, and his mother Elsa, his sister Nadia, brothers Volodya and Boris were killed. Later he discovered that his father Philemon, sister Vera, and brother Serge survived and moved to Canada. It's an interesting story how it all came together. In Kiev, Pavlo attended Zhenanska Church, a Baptist church, downtown Kiev really, where he met and married his wife Sophia in May of 1949. They were married for 65 years and had daughter Elena, son Alex, and son Serge, born in the 50s. In 1989, Paul and Sophia moved to Canada to his brother Serge, and in 1990, the entire family reunited in Saskatoon. Paul did not forget his friends in Ukraine. He stayed in close touch with the church, visiting Ukraine, sending funds, food, and clothing parcels to those in need. It was indeed a very moving ceremony, which his church community, his faith community, held for him in late December of 2023. Paul shared with me that his family left for Pilava from Kiev because they were persecuted and continually harassed. They were continually harassed by the authorities for their commitment to God and their Baptist church. Philemon, Pavlo's father, moved his young family to his own home village, meaning Pavlo had roots in this community, with Pavlo's older sister Vera, because in Pilava, as Pavlo and his father thought, there was a strong Baptist community despite the repressions and persecutions. They felt it would be safer in a smaller community rather than in Kiev under the strict gaze of police. This is where he met his 11th birthday in 1932. Starvation was rampant in the fall of 1932. Today, the village of Pilava, and if you think of the word Pilava, those who have Ukrainian roots probably would connect it to the word of dust. Pilava, pil, dust. The village of Pilava is a small enough community today of only 82 people. Its next door neighborhood, nominally a village as well, Stepanci, which is profiled in Pavlo's story, houses 433 residents. And together with a couple of other small communities, the Hromada of Stepanci has 1,974 residents, according to the stats which you can find on the website of today's territorial Hromada. But over the course of that fall in 1932 and later throughout the 33, the Hromada of Stepanci, of which Pilava is de facto neighborhood, lost 4,120 people who died of starvation. If you look at this particular slide, which can be easily located on the database of the Holodomor Museum in Kiev, and you would spend time just checking out the numbers against each other, you would spot and you would see that indeed Pilava had the highest losses in the entire region of Kaniv, rayon of Kaniv, I would say. The village saw it all. Pilava essentially and cumulatively was the vortex of all Holodomor experiences you have heard about, from deportations of the so-called Kulak families, through complete degradation of communal life, to loss of human dignity, to loss of sanity, to murder, cannibalism. Now, imagine you're an 11-year-old boy coming of age in this vortex of this catastrophe, witnessing it all through the haze of being half alive. What makes Pavlo's memory of Holodomor is his personal experience of what liminal experiences, what Simone Ghigliotti called limit events, and Victor Turner, an anthropologist, called the space and time of liminality. In my practice as an oral historian, I have been privileged to listen to many extended life stories concerning all kinds of pasts people lived through. But those individuals whose lives are marked by profound trauma, and especially those who have lived through socially engineered catastrophes, those folks, those people do not just tell stories. Limit events are events of such magnitude, continues Ghigliotti, a scholar of Holocaust. They're so profound, they're of such magnitude and profound violence that their effects rupture the otherwise normative foundations of legitimacy and the so-called civilizing tendencies that underline the constitution of political and moral community. As all principles of normalcy are violated in such times, such as Holocaust, or mass famines, genocide, wars, Holodomor, the narrative personal accounts of those are not bound by the same rules as other oral historical accounts, life stories or traditional storytelling. Individuals who lived through these limit events face a different task altogether, not to entertain, not to reminisce, but to testify, to make sure their account is listened to, given attention, documented, and when possible, carried on and woven into the fabric of the entire community account of what had happened. Individuals with such liminal experiences and their testimonies have a purpose: to expose the injustice, to impact the listeners, with hopes that the listeners will not abandon the story. Pavlo's account was exactly that powerful testimony, and he, I felt, was waiting for the opportunity to deliver this testimony his entire life. We were preparing to document it for a few months, and a team of people was involved in this work, including family, especially his daughter Elena, who guided Pavlo and all of us to what to expect. And I felt so often profoundly lost every time Pavlo would break down in tears, re-entering, dissecting his own memories and repackaging them again of those liminal experiences. But Elena, his daughter, would nod to me behind the camera, telling, continue on, please continue, my father is okay. I remember being challenged once by a European historian in an academic workshop on testimony research last fall, stating, where I showed this interview and I spoke about my experience interviewing Pavlo. That scholar stated that one cannot fully trust Pavlo's testimony, exactly on these very counts: weak health, young age, half dead, case of being half alive, limiting event, and now old age of reminiscing. How could we trust such testimonies? The colleague of mine was pondering out loud in front of the rest of academics. It is ironic, but a known truth in the field of oral history that testimonies age well and can multiply with time. Over the course of time, other accounts may emerge, creating opportunities for cross-referencing and comparing others' accounts to the one we are preoccupied with. And in Pavlo's case, his memories are corroborated by family accounts of what it was like to live and die in a famine, and by accounts of other villages, even from the same village. Those can be, by the way, searched again on the national databases of Holodomor testimony, witness accounts database, housed in the Holodomor Museum in Kiev. The memory can only become a force if it is shared over and over again. And that was the case with family memories of Pavlo's family as well. In 1954, in Saskatoon, Dr. Kostiv records a life story of Pavlo's father, Philemon. It's typed up in a nice, tidy way, and it's preserved in the family as such. Philemon came with the old brother Sergei to Saskatoon in 1948, and through his story, Philemon's story, we can have access again to experiences of his child. Philemon's story is an amazing account of so much more in addition to Holodomor, because his life was so different. You get a sense, though, of utmost tragedy that 1932 and 33 brought upon the villages. Philemon, we imagine, shared these memories with his children in Canada, in free Canada. But remember Pavlo, who has lost his connection to the family over the course of the World War II and didn't reconnect with his family until 1989, was not partaking in these circuits of family. Pavlo, memories flew into his own family. I'm going to play a segment from the interview, which is actually not a segment of an interview with Pavlo, but with his daughter. His daughter remembers eavesdropping on her parents at the very young age. And I hope it will start this
світі. Це вода все в свій час.
Пані Лена, а скажіть, будь ласка, ми говорили з вашим батьком про цю біду, про голодівку, Голодомор, як ми кажемо. А коли ви перший раз почули про це, от ви сама себе згадаєте?
Я вам не скажу точно дату, але коли ми вже в школу ходили, ми нічого не знали, але так, папа з мамою балакає, а діти ж як ті губки все. І мама розказувала також, що там жінка, де вони жили, ногу відрізали, варила, щоб дітей прогодувати. І вони починають згадувати, ми тут ушки на макушки, а потім вже починаємо питати, то вони нам розказували.
І ще коли ви дітьми були вони?
Ну, років мені про 10-12, і Сергію вже брату було 4 десь. І мені У нас 4 роки різниці, тому його десь.
Але не можна було іти і це розказувати далі.
О,
Тільки
ні,
можна було
ні.
родини. А що казали мама, папа? Казали Божу родини говорили? Чи як ви знали, що не можна?
Нічого не говорили. І ми вже з дитинства ходили в церкву.
Pavlo's children were born in the 50s, so these are the 60s we're talking about, when that was possible to share with him. Limited experiences were bursting into other testimonies within the family, and Pavlo's oldest sister, Vera, in the early 90s, only living in Canada, writes down her own account of the Holodomor, which is a very powerful testimony, very powerful narrative of memoir kind. Thank you. Hers is a chain of powerful, well-executed and straightforward stories upon stories which weaves like beads on a string of her own memories. And there are stories of multiple ordeals of her as a young Baptist girl subject to persecution and humiliation on so many occasions. She spoke of a double burden as a local believer, as a member of a Baptist community in particular, and because the local believers, her reference were deliberately excluded from whatever meager calls support those starving during the Holodomor were receiving, because they could still deliver the work. Let's hope we can get into this next. And now we are in Vera's story. I'd like to bring this story up in full because it features in the memory of Pavlo as well. We heard that the state farm, 12-15 kilometers away, needed workers to dig up beets. This is the fall of 1932, and carry them to the edge. They paid some money for this and provided balanda, meager kasha of a kind, once a day, along with 300 grams of bread, and for us children it would be just 150 grams. We got ready to go to work. My neighborhood friends, these are girls, and I took my 2 younger brothers with me, and we went there. We lived in the fields, in a straw haystack. People made holes and slept there. We could go home on Saturday and return to work on Monday, of course, but we just were exhausted. We didn't have strength to walk that far, so we stayed there until Sunday. Every day, people died at work and in that straw. The foreman had to be vigilant to ensure that no one ate the beets, even those that were thinned out and lying on the edges of the field. However, 100 people took them, hiding as best as they could, and then in the straw, they would sneak them in and then get sick and die. One day I couldn't bear it anymore, and I ate some beets as well. By a miracle of God, I survived. I suffered from excruciating stomach pain, vomiting, and I became so weak that I couldn't stand. My little brothers stood by my side crying. There was one kind woman who didn't go to work and sat next to me and began massaging my stomach. The foreman, though, came over and yelled at her, "Let her die, let her not steal state property. If only they allowed people to bake or cook these beets." The story resurfaces a couple of times in our working with Pavlo, twice actually, and that particular story becomes his. While first being cited when we were still preparing to document his testimony, and a bit of a narrative in a way repeats what Vera was saying, but that is his and only his story. It was him who had decided to go to Tahancha, now we know the name of the community. And by the time I got over the hill, I saw my sisters. He continues to comment on haystacks and how people made holes in them and how they rested in them and how 15 kilometers was too far to walk. And then we brought food one day, millet gruel, or sometimes they couldn't, or discarded beets, they leave them on the side, and so on and so forth, and how they were dying in those haystacks by those signs and commands said, "Let them die, let them kick off, we won't let them eat Soviet goods." And he continues on to describe how his sister Vera was suffering at the time and how a neighbor lady started massaging her down. And if you think about the fact that we as external researchers were privileged to listen twice to the same story, and then I found them in the other memoirs, imagine how many times it may have been shared with the family later on. Although we have 2 branches of families, one in Ukraine and one is in Canada, with brothers being on separate sides of that. Pavlo's accounts have been shared, speaking of his ability and his focus, have been shared with one breath. His voice being powerful, his sentences well-rounded, slowly coming along, like beads being added to the stream of his testimony. There were no words that can be taken out of his testimony. Really, this is what impresses you when you are working with transcriptions or revisiting the recordings. All words found their right spots, right places in that stream of his narrative. And here's how he was doing the witnessing, eyes closed, and I would like to thank the museum for putting together this most amazing segment. Adam, I hope.
Пам'ятаю одне свідчення було, що наш сусід через 2-3 доми, він утік якось з полону. І як він добирався до своєї хати, невідомо, але уже це було збіжжя, яке він посіяв на своєму городі. І він дійшов до того збіжжя і умер в тому. Збіжжі. І люди почули запах від якоїсь причини. Але коли добрались, відкуди йде цей запах, то знайшли його, бідного, вже вмершого, вже потерпівшого, який прийшов додому. Але сім'ї не було вже з ним. І він знайшов свою домівку. Тяжко було це бачити і чути. Але слава Богу, що ми пережили цей час, надіюсь на Бога, надіюсь на Його силу, на Його підтримку. І це було для нас велике щастя, що ми мали Божу милість над нами.
Pavlo needed listeners, and I was not the only person in the room. There were 4 of us, 3 documentarians and Elena. But with his eyes closed, Pavlo definitely spoke to a much larger audience than just those gathered in a living room. From the vantage point of his age, he testified before his entire extended family, his faith community, our academic community of testimony researchers, and before the entire world that he felt was his. It was the most profound testimony and work I have ever been involved in. A few words on listening. To testify before an audience of readers or spectators, Thalman Laub, 2 well-known scholars of Holocaust, commented, is more than simply to report a fact or an event or to relate what has been lived, recorded, and remembered. Memory is conjured here essentially in order to address another, to impress upon a listener, to appeal to a community, and to commit the narrative to others, to take responsibility in speech for history or for the truth of an occurrence. Very different kind of a truth that my critical colleague was once concerned with back in my seminar on testimony research I was referencing Thursday. A scholar of French and Italian literature, Thomas Trezies, reflecting on the importance of testimonial work and the collective memory of the Holocaust, reminds us that for generations after Shoah, how we listen to the Holocaust survivors is, as he put it, inseparable from the ways in which we practice with one another a present and future community. I argue that similarly, how we engage in, how we allow the stories of Holodomor to re-enter our own hearts, minds, and souls is important to who we are and to who we want to be. Remembering Holodomor brings Ukrainians together, whether they live in Ukraine or elsewhere. Remembering makes Ukrainians a force. And in a time when the Russian Federation is on a mission to destroy Ukrainian people, culture, language, and history in what is now seen as a genocidal war, remembering Holodomor is a contribution to truth, justice, and this very fight for the survival of Ukraine as a nation. Cherishing this memory means active remembering of what happened, and active remembering and public commemorations by lighting a candle are the means of sustaining who we are. Today, Russia returned to the old tactics of using starvation as a weapon. Starvation has been and continues to be observed by witnesses of Russian bombing and occupations in Ukraine's east and south. I recently started a project here in Canada titled Making Home in Times of Peace and War, Displaced Ukrainian Persons in Canada post-2022. And I've been interviewing with my team many individuals who have run away from the war and who have lived or escaped the occupation. I interviewed Marina from Mariupol, describing the house through which she and her family lived. In the spring of 2022, she mentioned to me the following.
Мы не знали, мы не знали, живы ли наши родственники, что тревога бесконечная. 11 марта у нас был второй прилет в наш дом. И такой прилет, спасибо, что живы остались случайно, потому что дети хотели пойти заклеивать окна, холод страшный, и запнулись об стол. И в этот момент прилет на второй этаж, сносит полностью. 6-го нам снесло третий этаж, а 11-го нам снесло полностью второй, и что осталось третий частично тоже снесло. Часть оставалась, и снесло полностью второй. И тут начинается пожар. Бежать некуда, холод. Везде обстрелы продуктов, стоят тревожный такой чемоданчик, дети хоть кашу какую-то, и в воду, потому что если мы выбежим из продуктов, то у людей тоже продуктов нет. Вот моя подруга, которая умерла без ноги, она повалила собачий корм, пока был, а потом шли приварить, размачивали ее, ну не было еды, правда. Люди голодали. Многие, кстати, мы тоже не знаем, это тоже не говорят, многие от голода шумели, переохлаждения, старики, у которых не только, вот они еле проснулись. У меня 14 лет моя школьная, она капнет. Поэтому 11 числа был прилет. Я помню так, что паники не было, никто не кричал. Мы настолько все уже устали, что как-то вот по-другому реагируешь, вот нету такого там. И тут...
Marina has shared many more other stories of people, painful, of degree of pain. And back in March 2022, while Marina was fighting for her children's lives and trying to find ways to feed them, and fighting for their very survival in Mariupol, in Saskatoon, in Mr. Nazarenko's living room, seated in front of the video camera, composed, focused and solemn, 101-year-old Pavlo began his story. In this living room, facing the elderly gentleman, sharing the most painful part of his life with outsiders for the first time, I became a 21st century witness to this resilience, to his faith and his victory. Immersed in the flow of Pavlo's memories, enveloped by his powerful, if fragile voice, surrounded by other witnesses to his testimony, I entered the most privileged space of memory and remembering. Old streams coming from across the large plains of history and converging into the powerful river of memory that carries us all. Thank you.